the controls or whatever I need, I'll share my screen. Okay. Okay, so I think everyone gathered is familiar with this. So I'll do the little intro and then we'll do it with some reflection on each of the 4 thoughts. Take care of us, guide us, inspire us, make us one with you. Now I have this unique opportunity, a free and well-favored human form, so difficult to find. But it will not last forever. Death can come at any moment. Wherever I'm born in samsara, there will be suffering. For both virtuous and harmful actions, karma's cause and effect cannot be escaped. O Lama, hold us with your compassion so that we may find the path to liberation. So, the 4 thoughts. Now the refuge prayer, twice in Tibetan, as always, once in English. Om Sanje Chota Soji Chonam La Jang Chu Body Dani Katam Jagi Gomde Yipe Sonam Ji
How else has he reacted to COVID-19? What is his views on underestimating the virus? This has been a strong
Dagi Gonde Jipe Sonamji Rola Benjil Sonje Drumaran. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the noblest Sangha, I take refuge until enlightenment is reached. Through the virtue generated by this meditation and practice, may I I'm handing over to Martin. We welcome you back again quite soon after your previous time. Less than, well, not much more than a month. So very much appreciated. And over to you. Thank you, Martin.
Okay, so could people just mute themselves, please? When it comes to the question and answer time, by all means, unmute. But there's a lot of background noise. Okay, that's we're going to just have 10 minutes quiet sitting, meditation. Then we'll have the talk. Then we'll have another period, just depending on how the time goes, another period of meditation, and then we'll finish off with any questions. We should be able to wrap all this up by 9 o'clock. Into sitting meditation. I think everybody knows what to do, so we don't need a guided meditation, I don't think. All right. Please sit relaxed. Okay. So the title of the talk that I gave for this evening is called Stories from My Teacher, or perhaps it should be Stories from My Late Teacher. In fact, the reason that I chose this title is because of this time of the year. The end of this month, the 29th, is actually her birthday. So I thought it would be quite nice to take the opportunity to reminisce a little bit and tell you a little bit about her. And as I was saying earlier, I sort of first developed an interest in Zen Buddhism in my sort of late teens, early 20s. And then when I came to London, I found the Buddhist Society. And from there, after having done their the sort of Fundamentals of Buddhism course, which is a course that's still run on a Tuesday night, we had the option of 3 schools to go to. We could either go to the Theravadan school, there was a Tibetan class as well, and there was a Zen class. And in the end, I opted for the Zen class, simply because I had done some reading on it and had some exposure to it beforehand. 1 or 2 other reasons, but there was that. And at that time, the class that I went to, Fundamentals of Zen Buddhism class, which was on a Monday night, was being taken by some of the senior teachers of the Zen group at that time. And then every so often, once a term, we would be visited by this rather small, squat, elderly Austrian woman who was ordained. She was a nun, and I found that her name was Myokyoni, Venerable Myokyoni. Her pre-ordination name was Irmgard Schlegel, that she was a doctor of geology. She had a doctorate in geology and she'd worked in the mines. She'd come over in the 50s to London, and she had departed in 1960 and went to Kyoto to undergo her own training there. She went to Daitokuji after an initial period, and there, under 2 teachers, first one called Master Sesso and the second one called Master Sojun. Under 2 teachers, she trained for 12 years. She was given what was called Inka, which is the authority to teach, and then she came back to London. She was still a laywoman at this time, and she taught in London at the Buddhist Society until in 1983, Christmas Humphreys died. He bequeathed his house to the Zen group, to the Zen Trust. The following year, she was ordained, and Shoboan, the temple, was consecrated, and she lived there and also at a second temple up in Luton called Fairlight up until her death in 2007. And the thing that particularly attracted me, in fact, in the end, wasn't the Zen, it was her. Because she had a real ability. Not only had she done a very traditional Zen training in Japan, in a training sodo, in a training monastery, but she had no airs about her, no airs and graces. She was very straightforward in her teaching, and she was very good at finding bridges between our Western way of understanding the world and the Buddhist way of understanding the world, which actually is tremendously different to the way that we in the West think about ourselves and think about the world, and so on and so forth. And the way she did this was to tell lots of anecdotal stories about herself to show that, in fact, what the Zen teachings were presenting was not something that was esoteric or exotic or, you know, oriental and inscrutable, but quite the reverse, that it was common and everyday, and that this was something that although this is a teaching that goes back 2,500 years and comes from halfway around the world, from a culture that's thoroughly alien to ours, and yet the human heart is the same, east and west, north and south, and that it is from this and to this that the Buddha's teachings, not just the Zen teachings, but all the Buddhist teachings, speak from and speak to. And so I thought it might be quite nice just to tell a few stories about, as I say, about her. Now, as I said, she was originally Austrian, and she came from a very rural part of Austria, the southeastern part, a province known as Styria, that's on the border with Hungary and Slovenia these days. And she used to say that it was stuck 300 years in the past. And she always said that, in fact, her soul was at least 300 years old. And she said this not so much to be a sort of stick in the mud, refusenik of the modern world type thing, but she was very clear that sort of atmosphere, that sort of the upbringing that she had, which was much slower. It was a way of living that was not sort of caught up in the sort of frenetic hurly-burly. And she used to give an example. She said, you know, obviously in Japan we sit formal meditation, but in fact, she said, you know, many people sit meditation quite naturally, you know, not formally. And she gave us an example. She said it was quite common on a Sunday afternoon. You know, everybody had been to church in the morning. They'd had come home. They'd had their Sunday lunch. And then in the summer, you know, families would go and sit outside, you know, in the front porch or in the front garden or perhaps under a tree. And she said, you know, they didn't sit talking to each other. They often just sat quietly for half an hour or an hour or so, you know, passing a few words here and there, but really just sort of looking out, looking on. And she said you would see these, you know, particularly the grandparents would be sat there. They had very busy lives, and they'd all had quite, you know, physically, they'd had very busy lives because, as I say, many of them were worked on farms and or connected with agriculture in some way. And on Sunday, it was a day that they could really relax, a day that they could just sit and generally do nothing. And thinking about this, because it did make me think, I thought, yes, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? We often complain that we don't have enough time to ourselves. We often complain that we're rushed off our feet. But actually, once a little bit of time does begin to open up to us, maybe during a lockdown, then we're constantly looking around for something to kill it with, you know, when we talk about killing time. And so I think, oh, well, I have to clean the windows, and I have to do this, and I have to repaint the skirting boards. And it's almost as if or perhaps I have to go and get do a new course on something. And she said it's almost as if somehow, and this is the way she would put it, she said it's almost as if we can't bear our own company for too long, just by ourselves and for ourselves. And she said, what a pity, what a pity. She said this is the problem even with formal meditation, what we call Zazen, a formal meditation, is that there's still a feeling that I'm doing something. You know, I'm doing some good by meditating. And so there's this sort of yearning and a desire behind everything that we do. as if somehow I'm trying to better myself or make things right for myself or my circumstances, or even for others as well. And she said, it's very important to just have that time where we can sit down. And she used to suggest an experiment to us. And she said, when we get back, you know, if we've been working during the day or been out and been busy, how nice it is to come back and sit in your most comfortable armchair and for 20 minutes, just do nothing. Don't switch on the telly, don't pick up the phone, don't make a cup of coffee, don't make a phone call, and just see what happens. And do that a few times, just see what happens. She said, what usually happens, of course, is that once we stop physically having something to do, then the old inner video starts rolling and we start going through all sorts of things and creating lists and all this sort of thing. She says, really, you know, it shows that there's something inside us that somehow doesn't want to just rest, you know, just be at peace with ourselves. And she would say, we have to ask ourselves why. Why is it that we cannot sit comfortably in our own company in this particular way? Well, she always described her upbringing. I mean, obviously in Austria, it's predominantly Catholic. It's strongly Catholic, and the area where she was also Catholic. But it's what she described as pagan Catholic. That people didn't sort of, you know, they weren't too much bothered about theology and so forth, but there was a very strong connection to the land and a very strong connection to place. And I think this is what she meant by the pagan side of it. She said, you know, we learned that in fact the place where we live can be our greatest teacher, and in fact is our greatest teacher. And you know, she said, I learned things about my own psychology. For example, even just when I, as a child, learning to ride a bike. She said the roads in Austria at that time, this was in the 1930s, late 20s, 1930s, they were potholed. I mean, as I said, it was a rural area. They weren't tarmacked or anything, so there were great holes in them. And she said, when you're learning to ride a bike, she said, you're sitting on this sort of wobbly thing like this, and you're going along, and you can see this pothole up ahead of you, and you think, I mustn't go into that pothole because otherwise I'm going to fall off this bike. So you stem yourself against it and try to go around. And she said it was like a magnet. It was like a dead shot every single time. She said I would go straight into that hole. And she said it was because I was frightened. You know, I was frightened of falling off the bike and I was frightened of hurting myself. She said, but once I learned to ride the bike, even if I tried to actually ride the bike into a pothole, she says at the last minute, the body would just sort of go like this and the bike would go around it. She said it was fascinating. And she had a saying that she used to give in connection with this. She said, and it showed me a very important psychological truth, that whatever you push away from yourself, you give power over yourself. She said, like that pothole, when I stemmed myself against it so as not to fall into it, and it just attracted me straight in. And it's quite interesting, particularly in our times where right now a lot of people are feeling anxiety and fear. And what do we find? You know, we find ourselves waking up in the middle of the night, or we find ourselves arguing with people on the telly, or we find ourselves arguing with the newspaper or whatever it is. There's something I don't like it. And the mind just goes back to it and back to it and back to it. And we suffer from this sort of, a sort of obsessiveness about those things that we turn ourselves away. And this is what she used to call picking and choosing. That we like to design our world pretty much so that we only have to experience, for myself, the things that I want to experience, the things that I like to experience, the things that are pleasing to me. And the things that I don't like, that I don't want, that displease me, those things I try and sort of push away. But strangely, they have a habit of coming back. They have a habit, as they were, of drawing us to them. And it's an interesting thing, certainly something that I found in my own training, that another way of looking at this is that the more that I want something, the more that I feel I cannot live without it, then the more frightened I become of either not getting it or being separated from it. And this is something that, of course, the Buddha pointed out as well, when he said, what is the noble cause of suffering? And he said, being disjoined or separated from what I like, and being conjoined with the things that I don't like. These are the things that cause me suffering. So it's this stemming myself against, this non-acceptance of things, this saying, no, I cannot, or I will not, that actually not only creates an enemy of the other, of the undesired thing, but actually also creates something of a rod for our own back as well. Now, the other thing that as she was growing up, and as I said, was living in a very rural area, the other thing that she really loved was horses and horse riding. I suppose I remember at school, a lot of the girls at my school as well, they all loved horses, and they all wanted to ride horses. It seemed to be a big thing, and it was for her as well. And so she did go as a child, and she went and she got lessons. And she learned to be a very good horsewoman, actually, in the end of it. But she said, riding with a horse, or learning to ride and training with a horse, she says, is wonderful Buddhist training as well, because you really learn something from these creatures, these animals. And she said a horse in particular is extremely sensitive to the state of the rider. If the rider is nervous, the horse picks that up very, very quickly and will become agitated as well. And she said, you can't lie to a horse because the horse can read the rider. Once the rider sits on the back and starts, the horse knows exactly what's going on. And of course, the horse has his or her own preferences as well, and wants his or her own way. And she used to give an example. So when she was learning to ride, they would do a certain number of exercises on the inside, indoors. And there was a large sort of corral that was in a square shape. And there would be, 4 or 5 riders, sort of usually young children who are learning to ride on their horses. And the horse trainer, the riding instructor, used to stand in the middle, and he would have a long stick, and on the end would be a sort of very small sort of wiggly whip. And what he used to do, if the rider wasn't doing the right thing, he would place the stick behind the person's back and just go like this, and it would make a sort of sound, and you knew that you were either slumping over or whatever, because you have to sit in a certain way, and you have to sit very upright as well in the saddle. Otherwise, again, the horse doesn't really respond too well. And she said the task of the exercise, or the aim of the exercise, was to be able to take the horse right into the corner, turn the horse, and then walk along the next side. Go right into the second corner, turn the horse again, go down the next side, and do that for all 4 corners. And she said the horses don't particularly like that one, because it means that they have to go into the corner, they have to stop, they then have to turn on the spot and then start again. And they don't like stopping and starting. It's rather like, for example, when people are walking, you get into a sort of a pace, don't you? And you just like, if you then, so for example, if you're walking down a street or on a country path, and someone in front of you is walking slower than you, and you come right up behind them, and they don't move to one side to let you pass, and you have to slow down, you sort of go, oh, think, oh, for goodness sake, because they're putting you out of your stride. Well, horses are like that too. They don't like that either. But it tests the skill of the rider, you know, to be able to, as it were, persuade the horse to go in and do what it's actually being asked to do. And then it will do it. Then it will do it. And so she said, you know, to begin with, it's a bit of a struggle. She said, but you come to the first corner, and the horse goes in. And you can feel the horse is trying to cut the corner, but you have to hold the horse to goes in, it turns, and then walks down the second way. It comes to the second one, goes in. You can feel the horse pulling away, but you have to absolutely hold it to it. Goes into the corner, turns, and goes the other way. And then you come to the third corner, and the horse begins to again to try and cut the corner because it doesn't want to do it. And you look and you see that the riding instructor's looking at someone else. And so you think, never mind, he won't see me do this. And the horse cuts the corner, you see. And then you come to the fourth corner. And of course, the instructor's looking at you, so you make the horse go in. So the first and second corner is not a problem now because the horse knows what it's supposed to do. But when it comes to the third corner, it got away with it the last time. And so it'll be damned if it's going to go into that corner. And of course, the instructor's now looking at you, and it doesn't matter. And she said, it doesn't matter what you do. You could pull the reins with all your might. That horse is not going to go into that corner. And so he cuts the corner. And at that moment, of course, the instructor sees it, and with that whip goes like this, just behind the back, and you go like this. The horse will then finally, after that, will then go into that corner again. And she said, it really taught me something. It taught me that the fastest way to learn something is through the body. She said, you can try and tell people things, but in monasteries, most of the time, there's very little talking. And it's actually quite a slow way. And she gave an example. She said, you know, we're all, tend to be a little bit impatient. And if we are in a bit of a hurry, you know, it's easy to rush through a doorway and then let the door behind you slam, as it were. Now, she said, you know, if the head monk was there, the head monk could say, now, Martin, please remember to close the door quietly. You're in a monastery. That is how you're supposed to do it. You don't just rush through and let the door bang to like this. Or when you come through, you just get rah, like this, an absolute shout, and you go like this, you see. But she says the next time you're rushing through the doorway and the door's just about to slam, she said something in you turns around and grabs hold of the door. And she says, and you do. And she said, you don't do it again. You don't let that door slam again. She said, because it goes directly in through the body. And it may sound, and as perhaps it's not something that we're used to because we like to be told. We don't like to be shouted at, but that's what happens in monasteries actually, and not just in Zen ones either. They can be quite tough and disciplined in that way. But actually, it shows something tremendously important, that when we are training with the emotional household, you cannot just talk to the heart. The heart doesn't respond just to words. In fact, it rarely responds to words. It responds to what the body is doing. And this is why, you know, when we're training, certainly with the emotional household, the use of the form, for example, is very important. And when we have that, when we have that knowledge and we apply that knowledge and we start working with the form, we find the practice goes much easier. So, for example, if we take a single practice like never to slam a door, and that includes a cupboard door as well, not just a doorway or a door in a doorway, but any door, just take it up for a week, or even just take it up for a day. Don't slam any doors, but always close them quietly. She said it's really quite difficult to do at first, but once you get the hang of it, it becomes a great practice for mindfulness and for developing awareness, because you can't do it without being aware. And that's its power. And that principle is taken throughout the whole of the training, and certainly in a sort of training sodo as well. And the other thing she said about it as well, the other thing that you learn, that she learned, she said, with horses, is that, of course, horses are like all animals. Their feeling side, their emotional side, is to the forefront. They don't lie about, they don't disguise how they're feeling at all. Just as they read other people and other animals, they also display how they're feeling straight away. And she said they can be quite sensitive, and horses can be quite sensitive, in fact. And she said it's one of those things, again, where you have to be quite careful as a rider. If you're riding down a road, down the side of a road, for example, you know, you're trotting along. Now, there's not a lot for the horse to do. So if you're sort of just trotting along, perhaps for a couple of miles, it's a bit boring, and that the horse gets bored. And so the horse will start playing around. And she gave the example of saying, well, you know, if there's a few leaves, say it's sort of coming into late summer, and there's a few leaves blowing about in the breeze, then the horse will sort of, you know, pretend to shy away and pretend to be scared, you know, and then it'll something goes over there and it'll go like this as well, and again it'll pretend to be, you know, a little bit frightened by it. And she said, as the rider, you have to be really careful to catch those moments. She said, because if you don't, there comes a point where the play turns into something real, where the play fear turns into a real fear, and the horse bolts away. And when the horse bolts, there's nothing you can do. You can pull and pull on the rein till it was bleeding, and it will not stop. That horse will not stop until it's ready to let you off, until it's exhausted. So, but she says, if you do recognize that is what's happening, if you do recognize that the horse is getting a bit agitated and a bit carried away, just a gentle pull like this, and it pulls that horse's head up into that good form, good rider's form. It reminds the horse that what it's supposed to be doing, it's carrying the rider. And she said the whole thing comes together and the horse won't bolt. And she used to tell this in conjunction actually with a story that used to be told by the Swiss psychologist, Carl Gustav Jung, of whom she was very fond. She used to call him Papa Jung. Jung told the story that an acquaintance of his, who was a professor of mathematics, was working in his study at home, and he was looking after his daughter, who was about 3 or 4 years old. She was playing quietly in the corner. All of a sudden, out of that corner came this scream of the little girl saying, "Daddy, Daddy, take the witch away, take the witch away." And Jung asked him, he said, well, what had happened? And he said, oh, well, the little girl, she was playing with 3 sticks, 3 spent matches that I'd given her. And she was playing Hansel and Gretel and the witch. We all know the story of the gingerbread house. And she said, it's the thing with children that, of course, as they play, rather like as the horse plays, they become more and more engrossed in what they're doing. And she said there came to a point, and this is how Jung explained it, it comes to a point where suddenly it tips over from play and the story becomes real. And in that moment, the witch becomes real. And in that moment, that's when the little girl screams. But this faculty of imagination and the way that it can stir things up or stir up our emotionality is not something that just happens to children. It also happens to us as well. So when we wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and we start buzzing around things in our mind, you know how it, you can sort of imagine it. You wake up and perhaps it was a car alarm going off outside, and you think, it's that blasted neighbour's car. It's always going off. Why doesn't he get it fixed? Why? And you know what? He borrowed that rake from me last summer, at the end of last year, and he's still not given it back to me. He probably thinks he's going to keep it. And I, like the fool that I am, I don't confront him about this. But isn't this just my life? Because, my boss doesn't appreciate me either. And he gives me all the rotten jobs because other people complain and I don't. I'm the willing horse. And he doesn't care about me and I'm not appreciated. And by about 4 o'clock in the morning, we are completely at war with the whole world. Nothing nothing's right. My life's a catastrophe, and I'm ready to do myself in. And this is really no different to that daddy, take the witch away, take the witch away. So but remember that horse riding. If you catch it early, and go, now Martin, there you go again. The whole world's against you. Now, just pull yourself together a little bit and just stop that. And maybe come back to the breath even. Or if I really can't sleep, I can get up and go to the loo, just walk about a bit and then go back to bed. And even just doing a few things like that just helps, as it were, gets the body involved once more, and I'm not so lost in my thinking and my thoughts. So later on, as I said, she went and studied at university, and she studied geology at university. And she always said that her first Zen teacher actually was her geology professor at Graz University. And she said he was a thin, small, wiry man. But he said we all looked up to him because he had a real natural wisdom about him. And he came in one day, and we were all chatting away to each other, the students. And he went to the front, and there's a big blackboard there, and he took a piece of chalk and he drew a line on the blackboard there. And he turned around and he looked at all the students and he said, now, if I was to ask you, is that a straight line or is that not a straight line? Some of you would say, yes, it is. And some of you would say, no, it isn't. And it wouldn't take very much to set you all arguing with each other. And then he picked up the blackboard ruler, which is just a very long ruler that you use for drawing straight lines. He said, all you have to do is this. And he placed the ruler against the line that he had drawn. And he said, now you know. And he put the ruler down. And he said, there's no need then to fall into that argument. And this was something, again, that stuck with her, because she said when she came to Japan, it was the same. You know, people often ask questions when they come into Buddhism. Do I have to believe in karma? Do I have to believe in rebirth? Do I have to believe in the bodhisattvas and all this sort of thing? She said, we're always looking for something to speculate about, to either agree or disagree with, and so I can go yap, 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 she said. But actually, what the Buddha actually asked us to do was to try out his teachings for ourselves, to take them on faith to begin with, because he is the Buddha, obviously, but to try those things out for ourselves and to come to an understanding of just how those things might be true. We have a tendency to want to form an opinion. And once we've formed an opinion, they are very, very sticky. And we have a great difficulty in being able to change that and to lay that down. And she said, a good Buddhist training helps us to do that. Because the problem is that we tend to identify with it a little bit too much. And that was the lesson she learned from him. She said the other thing that she learned from him was that, of course, because it was a geology course, they had a lot of field trips. They lived obviously quite close to the Alps, the Austrian Alps, and they would go up into the mountains on their field trips, and they would, collect samples and so forth and bring them back. So quite often they had to walk quite a few miles in order to get to the sites that they needed to get to. And of course, she said, we were all young and headstrong and, we would sort of dash on ahead. But he was, middle-aged man. He would set quite a slow pace, but he always set a very steady pace. And we would run out of breath very quickly, and we'd have to sit down and have rest. And then he would catch up with us, and then he would walk on ahead, always at that slow, very steady pace. And she said, I really learned something from that too, that it's very easy to be like a straw fire. She said sometimes this happens in Buddhism, and it's part of human nature as well. that people come in, they're all enthusiastic. They want to read every single book on Buddhism, and they want to know every single bit of philosophy, and they want to talk until 4 o'clock in the morning with their friends all about shunyata and koans and all the rest of it. And then she says, after 6 months, you find that they're no longer coming. And usually what's happened is they've found something else now that's far more interesting. I think it's not Buddhism, it's going to be Vedanta. That's what I need to do. Or maybe I need to go and do Tantra, or maybe I need to go and do Shinto, or maybe I need, and we can butterfly in this way. She said, far better it is to set a slow, boring, steady course, but to just keep going at it. She said, my goodness, if you really want to know how to overcome even apparently insurmountable obstacles, she said, just set that slow, steady course. And she used to tell the story along with that about the man who had fashioned a jewel for a beautiful jewel. And he often took it out to look at it. And one day he was walking by the seashore, looking at this jewel, and the sunlight was glinting off the facets of this jewel. And the dragon that lived in the bottom of the sea, because that's where the dragons live in China, saw that. And of course, Chinese dragons love shiny objects, just as Western dragons do. And up he came, leapt out of the ocean, grabbed hold of the jewel, and dived back down to his palace at the bottom of the ocean. And the man stood bereft. The one thing that he loved most in life had been stolen from him. And when he'd recovered himself sufficiently, he called out to the dragon, but the dragon ignored him. But the man said, look, he said, I know you can hear me, and I want you to know this, that I vow that I will get my jewel back from you. And the dragon laughed and said, you will never be able to get this jewel back from me. And the man said, yes, I will. He said, because I'm going to get myself a bucket and I'm going to empty this ocean out, bucketful by bucketful. And one day I will come into your palace, which will be standing in the midst of a desert, and I will collect my jewel. And he said, and again the dragon laughed and said, you, with your mortal life, you would never have the time, even if you were to do this now for the rest of your remaining years. And the man said, but you don't understand. My vow is that I will come back. And at some point I will be reborn in a human form. And when that happens, I will be back to continue this task of emptying the bucket out. And the lifetime after that, and the lifetime after that, and the lifetime, however long it takes until this ocean has been emptied out, I will walk into your ruined house and get back my jewel. Now, dragons live for a long, long time. And he could tell, this dragon, from the sincerity and the depth in this man's voice, that he meant every single word. And someone who is in dire, someone who really has nothing to lose, when they make a vow like that, there's very little in the universe that can truly stop that from happening. At some point it's going to happen. And the dragon, who is very long-lived, realized this, and at that moment fear arose in the dragon's heart, and so he swam up to the surface and spat the jewel out onto the shore, where the man picked it up, dried it off, put it back in his pocket, and went on his way. So that was the other thing that he did. Just a couple of other stories, I think, before we stop. There are lots and lots of these stories, but I think just a couple more. When she first went to Japan in 1960, this was a time, we have to remember that, the 50s had been the beat poets. A lot of people had become interested in Zen, particularly amongst the sort of intelligentsia and the university lot. And so people were traveling, a lot of those early pioneers, and we're talking about Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance and so forth. Well, a lot of people like Philip Kapleau and so forth were going. Gary Snyder as well, who was a poet, was going. And Fritz Perls, one of the founders of Gestalt therapy, as well, was there in the 60s. And they were, you know, people were experimenting with all sorts of things as well. And so a lot of Westerners were coming along, and to help those who were particularly sincere, there was a temple that was run by a woman called Ruth Fuller Sasaki. And Ruth Fuller Sasaki had married a Japanese Zen priest called Sokean, who had lived in New York for many years. And after Sokean died, she moved over to Japan, where she was ordained, and she ran a small temple for Westerners who wanted to train, you know, at the training sodo. Just to get them used to the Japanese language, the Japanese way of life, and so on and so forth. And so it was a period where, you know, you were basically getting broken in, so that you didn't stick out too much as a foreigner. And, you know, the one thing that everybody had great difficulty with was the Japanese way of sleeping on a futon on the floor. And of course, I'm not talking about those, you know, big, thick futons from the futon company that people buy nowadays and have. These are the traditional Japanese futons that are quite thin, actually, and they just lay on the floor, on the floorboards. And she said everybody had, you know, none of us had slept on futons, none of us had slept on the floor, everybody slept in a bed. So this was completely novel for us, and we all suffered terribly from cramped shoulders and backache and everything else. And everybody used to go and moan to Ruth Sasaki about it. But, you know, this is the way that the Japanese slept. And if you were going to go up to the monastery, you had to get used to the fact that there were no beds. This is how everybody would sleep. But she said we would still go in there. And she said Ruth Fuller Sasaki, who was this, you know, very sort of straight-speaking American woman, had this sort of stock answer whenever anybody complained. She said, look, she said, just keep at it. Just keep sleeping on the floor, on that futon. She said, sooner or later, you know, something's going to have to give, and it won't be the floor. And from that, again, Yokioni, you said, you know, she said it's a remarkable thing. But she said, we're so impatient. We often won't give ourselves time to adapt and to adjust. And so we prefer to complain and try to shift things around to suit myself. And again, the other story that she told was that later on, when she moved out of the temple, she moved into a small flat that was quite near Daitokuji, and it was perfect location. But she said it was a very typical tiny Japanese flat in a city. She said you had one room downstairs and a room upstairs with a small bathroom just off the bedroom, which was upstairs. And she said there was virtually no room. You had a sink and you had a toilet. And she said that was literally it. And she said the way that it had been constructed, she said, when you were at the sink, if you bent down to splash water in your face, behind you was the brass towel rail. And she said, I was forever cracking, you know, my backside, the top of my backside on that thing. You know, she said it was murder. And she said I was black and blue, and I was getting to the point of thinking, I can't cope with this. I'm going to have to move out and find somewhere that's bigger than this, because it's just not working. And then a few months later, she was visited by some friends from England who come to stay with her. And so she slept downstairs, and the couple had her bedroom upstairs. And after a couple of days, the wife said, my God, how do you cope with that bathroom? She said, every time I try and, wash in that sink, I crack my back and my, on that towel rail. And it suddenly occurred to me, Yokioni, that she hadn't done that for months. And without her even consciously realizing, her body had adapted to the cramped conditions. And it was from that moment on that she realized that it's not I who has to adapt. Actually, the circumstances themselves teach the body how to do this. And quite naturally, we will do this if we give ourselves enough time. And she used to use this, you know, say, for example, when people used to, were learning to sit on a cushion, for example, cross-legged. You know, we're not used to sitting on the floor cross-legged, most of us. We were brought up to sit in chairs. So suddenly trying to sit on cushions, we find it difficult. And quite often we want to sit on a chair, you know. She said, but she would always try and encourage people to try at least to sit on the cushion, you know, if they were flexible enough. Obviously, if you're not flexible and you're the bones, you've got a bit of rheumatism or a bit older or whatever, you may not be able to do it. But if you're a bit younger, you usually can. But again, people would complain, sort of saying, oh, you know, I can't do it. It's my leg goes there, my leg. And she would always gently try and persuade them, just go back to the cushion, just go back to the cushion. And it is true. I remember when I used to go to the temple, in the morning, we chant for half an hour. We have these chants that go on for about half an hour. And we sit we sit what's called seiza, which is on our knees, with your bum resting on your heels, and your feet are pointing back like this, and you rest your bum on your heels. And after 25 minutes, I then had to get up. And by which point my legs were completely dead. I mean, it was almost, I had to fall over sideways and then just lie there until the feeling came back into my legs, and then I could get up again. But when I went to live in the town, and I didn't do that every day, but just on Memorial Days, and there were about half a dozen of those throughout the year. So I wasn't doing it very often. But when I went to live in the temple, I found that after about a week to 10 days, after about a week to 10 days, actually my legs stopped going dead. And although they would be stiff, I could get up straight away and walk, which was something that I simply couldn't do when I first started sitting in seiza. And I'm quite sure now, because I haven't sat in seiza for a long time, that my legs will go completely dead. But that's the fascinating thing, was that I didn't have to do anything special. My body itself adapted, the nerves in my legs adapted, because that's why your legs go dead, of course. It's not that the blood circulation gets cut off, otherwise we'd all be dead of sepsis. Not at all. It's simply that the nerves get pinched, the motor nerves and the sensory nerves, which is why you can't feel or move your legs. But somehow they readjust themselves. Somehow if you just keep at it long enough, then those things will continue to work. Well, I think I'm going to leave that there for now. As I say, there are many other stories, and I could go on a lot longer, but I think I will leave it there. No doubt I will. I come back often enough so I can always add a few more stories in the next time. But I think for now, we'll leave it there. So what I'm going to suggest is that we just sit quietly, maybe for 10 minutes again. So we'll have a 10-minute sitting, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. All right. Okay, if you'd like to unmute yourselves. Okay. So, anybody has any questions? I'll do my best to try and provide an answer.
I think this is a question I might have asked you before, but like you, I'm very interested in the great Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung. And yeah, I've read quite a few of his works, so I'm pretty sure you have. And I think I might ask you the question before that. So, but Carl Jung, he talked about the process of individuation, how life, you could view it as a journey towards self-actualization. And as far as I can gather, this process of individuation is reconciling ourselves to our shadow and reconciling the polarities within our psyche, etc. So how do you think this compares to the Buddhist path towards enlightenment, would you say?
Well, I think because the path of individuation, as you say, is about begins with a confrontation with the shadow, and that's certainly something that happens as part of a Buddhist training, simply because when you undertake a discipline, you inevitably are confronted with your own emotional reactions that go to make up what that shadow is. I have a friend of mine, Roberta Mansell. She's an artist, and she's recently finished illustrating the Lotus Sutra. She spent 18 years doing this project, and halfway through it, she was invited by, I think it was the British Library, were running a conference for craftspeople and artists who were involved in some kind of religious art making. And she met up with a woman, a Western woman, European woman, who had trained in Chinese brush and ink painting. That is the calligraphy and then the paintings that often accompany the calligraphy when making those large, beautiful scrolls. And she said when she started, she was already an artist. But trained in the Western way. And she decided to do this. And so she found herself a Chinese art teacher. And the teacher said, yes, I'll train you. So she said, what I'd like you to do is to draw a leaf. And the way you draw a leaf is like this. It's 3 strokes. There's the stem, there's one side, there's the other side. Okay, and she gave her the brush and said, copy that. So she took the brush and she copied it as best she could. And she said, yeah, it's not quite right. You see that this line's not quite right. Do it again. And, she had to do it about a couple of dozen times. And then the teacher said, yes, that's okay. Now I want you to go and practice that every day for at least half an hour and come back to see me in a month. And so a month later, she came back and she said, let's see your leaf. So she drew this leaf and she said, yes, not bad, but this point isn't quite right either. So she corrected it when she made her do it and get it right. And then she said, come back in a month, continue with this leaf. She said, this went on for 6 months. And she said, all I had done was draw a leaf. She said, when was I going to get onto the bamboo? And what happens with the sparrows, and the cherry blossom. And she said, I'm just doing a leaf. Anyway, after 6 months, her teacher accepted what she had done. But what the teacher said to her was, she said, the technical side of this art is very easy to learn. The difficult thing is what you just had to do. She said, by the time you've finished with me, if someone wakes you up at 3 o'clock in the morning, sticks a brush in your hand and says, paint the bamboo, you will be able to do it with your eyes closed. When you've had a blazing row with your husband, if somebody stuck a brush in your hand and said, paint the mountains, you would be able to paint the mountains perfectly. If you were feeling at the end of your tether that you felt that life wasn't worth going on, and somebody put a brush in your hand and said, paint the cherry blossom, you would be able to perfectly execute the cherry blossom. She said, this is what you have learned. You can now contain yourself. And under all circumstances, no matter how you feel, you will always be able to be a brush painter. And she said in that 6 months, she went through every emotion in the book many times: frustration, joy, the whole gamut, boredom. She said, you just had to learn to contain it. whatever came up, and this is what the shadow is, whatever comes up, you learn to contain it. You don't let it carry you away. It no longer has power over you anymore. So without a shadow of doubt, whenever we undertake any discipline, particularly a spiritual discipline, and we really apply ourselves in this way, then we are confronting the shadow, because sooner or later that shadow is going to come. Even sitting meditation, I mean, we're all sitting meditation. You sit, there are days when you are coming up with, you don't want to do it. You come up with all the most holy and religious, righteous reasons why just today you don't have to sit meditation. And this is the shadow. So yeah, that goes on. And then the other thing with the opposites and so forth. I mean, I think what's important to say is that Jung's method is different. His method and techniques are different, deliberately so. He wanted to develop a non-religious way of spirituality, if you like, and that's why I think a lot of his work is very popular with a certain, certain types of people here in the West, and he did that deliberately. But I think that the Buddhist path does go further, not necessarily more explicitly, particularly in the Bodhisattva path. So that path of being of service to all sentient beings. I mean, I think for Jung, he thought that would come up quite naturally, and he was very clear that the work that he did with his patients saved his life as much as it saved their lives as well. And so he certainly recognized the value of a life of service. But this is something that's very much brought out in the Bodhisattva path. I mean, the path to enlightenment is the Bodhisattva path, the path where we are of service to all sentient beings. And I think that's something that compassion and wisdom is something that's very important and front and center in Mahayana Buddhism. I don't know if that answers your question.
That's excellent. Yes, it does. Thank you, Martin. Excellent.
Martin, I wonder, did your teacher ever say whether these experiences from native Austria, for instance, the lessons from these situations, did she get the lessons once she became a practitioner, or did she register them at the time? Did she ever talk about that?
She didn't explicitly, but I think these were undoubtedly things that came up later as well, as these things do, But obviously, for some reason, she certainly reflected. She must have reflected on them, and her memory of these things, seemed to come up certainly later on in life. She certainly said on many occasions, there were times when, I'd be at a particular juncture in the training in Japan, when suddenly out of the blue, into memory, this memory would float up. And I'd suddenly think, oh my goodness, that's what's going on, So yes, I mean, I think it's one of those things that, I mean, maybe she part reflected on it at the time or shortly afterwards as well. But I think obviously because she was involved intensely in the spiritual training, that creates a framework within which one sees these experiences in a particular way, so my guess is that they were revised several times.
Yeah, it's interesting. It reinforces or confirms the notion that we can learn from any situation here and now.
Yes.
Rather than seeking, these mystical experiences in the Far East or something like that.
At the top of the mountain. The top of the mountain has a place, and periods of solitude have a place in spiritual training, obviously. But yes, I mean, a lot of these stories were, and this goes to the heart of Mahayana Buddhism. It's about your everyday life, the life of the householder. The training that we do is the same training, whether you're ordained or laity. The whole idea is that we don't have to retire into the forest in order to do this. That the daily life itself, the ordinary, your circumstances and my circumstances are exactly what we need. And in fact, Nyokuni used to put it like this. She said, you know, at the end of the day, she said, karmically, we are exactly where we need to be. Otherwise, we will be somewhere else. You may not know it. You may not always feel that you're where you want to be. She said, but karmically, we're where we need to be. We're right where the Dharma wants us now. Otherwise, we'd be somewhere else.
Thank you.
Well, I think we're coming up to the witching hour.
Yeah. COVID shutdown. Well, Martin, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
May I interject here and help you wind down? The story of the futons put me in mind. What is it? Either the futon gives in or the floor gives in. Or...
Sooner or later, something will have to give way. It won't be the floor.
Remind me of that story of Oscar Wilde. Broken man lying on his deathbed, looking at this dreadful wallpaper and apparently saying, one of us is going to have to go. Well, Martin, thank you so much. As always, so willing to share with us yours and in particular your teacher's wisdom tonight, the storytelling. You're a great storyteller yourself, and I'm wondering if that was a trait before you met her or has developed since knowing her, but we've always enjoyed your illustrative anecdotes. Always been very helpful. So once again, much appreciated. This is being recorded and therefore we'll make it available to all our members who may or may not be able to make it tonight. And we do hope to see you again sometime in the future, in the flesh one day. And
I hope so too.
Yeah. Suzanne, do you know this person who just handed you a cup? Was it just something
it was the mystery arm which just floated through and delivered exactly what was needed.
Benign intruder.
There you go. Your own bodhisattva who you've well trained.
Shall we do a dedication, Martin? Should we do ours, or do you want to give one?
Would you mind doing that?
Not at all. I'll share my screen. We have one that's familiar with.
Okay. Let me just,
oh, you need to enable me to screen share. Just say when. No. Oh, okay.
And I suggest everybody mutes. Sorry, everybody just.
Okay. You disabled me again, I think, or?
No, we can hear you.
Well, I was going to display something, Martin.
Sorry?
I shan't bother because I think everyone knows it off by heart, except you. You can do your own. Okay. May whatever benefit that arises from this practice go to the benefit of all sentient beings, stirred by the waves of birth, sickness, aging, and death. Yeah. May they be free from the oceans of samsara. Well, once again, we say goodbye. At least we don't have to wait for a train.
No.
Railway station, Martin. There are a lot of benefits from this lockdown situation. And we hope to see you soon. Good luck with all your own projects and
thank you.
Your website. We do see
thank
it
you.
sometimes, and we hope to see you in due course. We won't make a nuisance of ourselves. We don't expect every fortnight anyway. Maybe once a month or 2 months. Martin, thank you. Good night.
Yeah, good night, Martin. Thank you.
Problem.